In this video, I'd like to capture and summarize some of the issues we have discussed and explored in the previous video. Now, the previous video seemed to have spent a long time exploring a certain type of coding, but slowly I introduced a bunch of concepts which led us to the idea of functions. And the idea of a function, which I'm calling fn for short, is you pass it parameters and it operates on them and does various things, and it returns some value out of that function, and it becomes a very useful unit that you can use, and it's a very, very powerful way. Now let's have a look at some of the issues that we have and go back to our stick figure example. In our stick figure example, we would draw our stick figure using the draw stick figure function, which I'll call draw SF for short. Okay, we would use that at a colon prompt and draw it. But what we really want to do is be able to maintain information between uses of functions. Now, those of you, and some of you have already tried this, there is a way of declaring global variables. I'm not going to linger too much on that, other than to recognize that that is where the real issue. If you do code with global variables and you cannot see the shortcoming of that, then perhaps a few minutes just spent clarifying this. What do we mean by global variables? It's when you store a piece of information related to the use of a function outside of that function, but not inside any other data, any other kind of structure. So for example, global, if we store things globally, right, I store them outside of a function, say up here, then I have my first function here, and I have my second function here, and my third function here. And the idea is that each of them can access and manipulate this global variable. So if I create a stick figure from my first function, I would store the detail and location of it, and if I want to move it or do other things, I can then refer to the same location. Why don't programmers like this? Well, there's several different issues with this, and we don't have enormous amount of time to go into it because it does get quite abstract and complex. It's to do with data and managing and controlling data. That's part of the problem. And it's also, there's a lot more buried inside these sets of concepts. So if you've started to code where you just put, the name of the head, you put the head, the lines and the arms outside of any function, and inside the function you declare it and do stuff with it, it superficially looks like it's resolved a problem. And this is its attraction, right? But actually, it's not the safest way to do it. There are problems and issues with it. One of them is to do with the fact that if you were reusing this function here, I'll give you a very simple example where the shortcoming is. Say this is a very useful function, but it refers to a variable inside its code. It's not passed in, remember, this is inside its code. It's referring to a variable which I've defined outside. You can't reuse that function without needing that global variable. That's a bit of a problem. Okay. And I know I've seen several people's codes using global variables also as a solution to the coursework. It's fine when you haven't been given, but as a temporary solution, it's okay. But actually in the long term, we have an issue. So we come to our second real major issue, which this is connected to. And that is code reuse. So what is the issue here for code reuse? Well, the truth is no one wants to keep on writing the same code again and again. And we actually want to organize our code so we can reuse bigger and bigger chunks of it. The issue you have is that essentially this is if you write it properly as a function, and to write it properly as a function, it means you pass it parameters. Inside the code, you don't refer to global variables of any kind. You can delegate it and so on, as we said before, but that's a different issue. But essentially, the data it receives, it operates on, comes in through here. Then it returns back to whoever used this function. Now, by creating that type of structure, you can reuse this. There are other issues with reuse, and that is what kind of data, what kind of values, what kind of imports, and so on that you have. But reuse is essentially, if you do it well, it is still limited to the level of these functions. So if I'm building up a complex piece of code, I'm using tiny, tiny jigsaw puzzles in order to combine, and then I combine them and link them together like a jigsaw puzzle, and I create my program. So the issue is that you can reuse code, but it's very, very low level. We come to perhaps the most significant issue, is that so far when we've coded, you might have struggled with this, procedural code breaking itself into small subroutines and functions, as we've been talking about, and if you're not sure, please go back. It's useful to a point, but what happens if we want to model the real world? And what do we mean when we model the real world? Well, if you think about the real world, we tend not to think of just a bunch of functions. We tend to think of someone or something doing something. If you look at the basic structure of our sentence, right, let's not keep on using red. I walked, right? We tend to have this idea of a subject or an object and some action. We generally in our everyday life don't eliminate this part. For example, if you have a car, we tend to think of driving not in isolation from the object, the car, right? So what we have is this really strange and interesting point we've arrived at, where all of this procedural code has given us functions and sort of gives us ways of modeling things, actions and verbs and things to do, but it doesn't really give us any way of modeling the object, like a car, which is, you know, which you're driving. It doesn't give you. It's easy to see with people, but let's talk about objects. Let's say I have a mobile phone, and most of you do, right? Mobile phone is an object, right? And it does lots of different things. So far, our way of coding, if we wanted to model a mobile phone, we would so far only be able to model just a collection of different functions. How are we going to maintain all the issues of data? That becomes a complex issue, as we've hinted at, because of the worries of global data and so on and so forth. So functions have been very useful, but if we're trying to model real world processes, we are stuck. So the question I want to ask is, what do you mean by modeling real things? You know, what's the point of it? And this next concept is absolutely critical. It's to do with complexity. When we think about the world and the complex real world, we tend to break it up into objects, right? Situations or conditions and behaviors or actions of those objects and so on. So far, procedural coding is very good with this bit here, behaviors. But if we're trying to model an object like a person, a till in a supermarket, a car, a rocket, a helicopter, a musical instrument, whatever we might be, which does things, we can't really We have to artificially glue these different functions together, and we then get into a really, really big issue that because we're only modeling the behaviors, we've got no real way of raising the level of our complexity for our code. Our complexity sort of gets stuck because behaviors are modeled largely on functions. Functions are very, very low level, right? And because they're low level, how do we model really complex systems? You know, airport control systems, for example, that's massively complex. But if it's just a bunch of functions, it's too small and it's too low level in terms of dealing with this high level of complexity. What we want is a way, what we really want is a way of organizing our code differently. Now, so far that's just fairly an abstract concept, right? And you might think, you know, you've kind of talked about the difficulties of procedural programming. I'm an inexperienced programmer. I can see I can use them. I can model stuff. I don't quite get the point. So what we're going to do in the next video is we're going to introduce this other way of thinking, and hopefully you will start seeing just how powerful it is. But remember, what we're trying to do is organizing code differently so we can deal with different types and higher levels of complexity. Because just having a bunch of functions is not enough. And even if you do have global data, that's definitely not enough, and it limits reuse and has all kinds of other issues. And it reached actually historically a limit in what you were doing with that type of stuff.